thank you for coming here now. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Shaun Harper.
Thanks a
Yes,
lot.
sir. You're welcome.
I really appreciate that.
Yes, sir.
But at least one person will leave this room thinking I'm terribly overrated.
Not any of us.
Okay. Good afternoon. Good to see you all. I am absolutely thrilled to be home. I'm not an Indiana native. I grew up in South Georgia, but Indiana was the birthplace of my intellectual work in higher education. As Dr. Davenport just mentioned, I did my PhD at Indiana University and took many courses here on the IUPUI campus. So there's something about being here that is especially gratifying to me. So I'm indebted to Dr. Kim Nguyen and her team for inviting me. I'm especially indebted to my best friend and academic wife, Dr. Lori Patton Davis, who recommended me to the organizers of the conference. It's just really good to be here talking with you today. So here's what I would like to do. I figured that some people would appreciate if I operationalized the term that Professor Patton Davis and I both used in our abstracts and titles of our talks. In case you all missed her talk this morning, it was downright fabulous. She's a genius, right? But she and I both talked about, and I'm going to talk about, what we call minoritized students in STEM fields and in other parts of American higher education. What we mean by that is Professor Patton and I argue that, there was an M there somewhere, that minoritized signifies the social construction of underrepresentation and subordination in U.S. social institutions, including colleges and universities. I want to go on to sort of unpack this just a bit more. We argue that persons are not born into a minority status, nor are they minoritized in every single social context. For example, I live in Philadelphia and I worship at a predominantly black Baptist church on most Sunday mornings. When I'm in that space, I'm not a minority, right? But when I go to the University of Pennsylvania where I teach, I'm the first faculty person of color hired in my department, and I remain the only faculty person of color there. I am indeed minoritized in that space, right? Because there are things that come along with being the only one that I think also happens to students in the STEM classroom and in their interactions with STEM faculty and so on. We go on to suggest that people are indeed rendered minorities in particular situations and institutional environments that sustain an overrepresentation of whiteness, hegemony, and imperialism, and status differentials. So I sort of push back against, in a very active way actually, the whole sort of designation of underrepresented racial minorities. Because those students whom we're talking about in STEM fields, they actually were not underrepresented, nor were they minorities at Albany State, the historically black university I attended as an undergraduate. So I just thought that that was an important sort of linguistic framing and note here. So what I'm going to talk about is moving beyond deficit perspectives on minoritized students in STEM fields. Much of it very much comes from a project which was one of the most intellectually rich and rewarding collaborations in my faculty career. It was with Professor Christopher Newman, who teaches at University of San Diego. A couple of years ago, he and I co-edited a volume titled Students of Color in STEM. And honestly, our goal in this particular volume was to re-engineer, if you will, a research agenda about students of color in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics fields. He and I believe it was actually his genius that led us to this. We brought together an incredible cast of higher education scholars, most of whom had received research grants from NSF, NIH, Lumina Foundation, and other places to fund groundbreaking research on blacks, Latinos, low-income Asian Americans, Native Americans, and so on in STEM fields. So we thought, given that these people had gotten money from NSF and other places, that they might help us to imagine a more expansive sort of research agenda and umbrella concerning minoritized students in STEM. In my own chapter and in the framing of the volume, Professor Newman and I actually talk about the theme, right? Like one of the themes of this conference, and something that is very much at the heart of the Alliance, broadening participation in STEM fields. I would argue, and I would invite you to disagree with me during the question and answer, not right now, but during the question and answer period, I would invite you to disagree with me that many of the questions that researchers consistently ask and the ways in which practitioners consistently frame their work has very little actually to do with broadening participation. It's mostly about identifying barriers to participation. So in the volume, Professor Newman and I sort of talk about these 5 commonly recycled questions, these questions that have been beat to death by researchers, and I would argue even by people, well-intentioned people who are involved in practice on college and university campuses. So these 5 questions: why do so few pursue STEM majors? Right? That's an important question, right? People of color are tragically underrepresented in STEM fields. We know that, right? So there is this sort of recycling of this question. We're trying to understand the social determinants and other kinds of forces that cyclically reproduce underrepresentation for people of color, right? Researchers have also concerned themselves with this question of why are they so underprepared for college level math and science courses? Why are their grades and other academic achievement indicators lower than their white and Asian American peers? Why do so many change their majors to non-STEM fields, right? And why do so few continue on to graduate programs in STEM? Now, again, I am not suggesting that we abandon the pursuit of these questions, because there are some yet to be identified barriers and determinants that help explain these very durable patterns that we see in the STEM educational pipeline. But I would argue, though, again, that these 5 questions on their own will do very little to broaden participation of Blacks and Latinos in STEM fields. So I want to sort of talk about how my work is framed and how I think it might be instructive for those of us who care very deeply about increasing access, success, and participation rates in science, technology, engineering, and math. So I'm going to share with you insights from 3 reports from the Center for the Study of Race and Equity in Education, the center I direct at Penn, as well as 2 large-scale multi-institution qualitative studies. Now, to do this, I'm going to talk about one specific population, although the kinds of trends and concepts and so on that I am about to describe very much apply to other populations, right? So I'm going to talk in an illustrative way about my research on Black undergraduate men, right? But everything that I'm about to say, for sure, is relevant to Latino male students, to Latinas, to Black women, low-income Asian American students, and Native Americans. In a policy report that the center co-produced with the Institute for Higher Education Policy in Washington, D.C. last year, I argued that the problem is with the problem. And the narrow, sort of one-sided way that the problem gets talked about in research, practice, and policy. So in this particular policy report, Frank Harris, who's another collaborator of mine, he and I sort of laid out for policymakers at state, federal, and institution levels sort of ways in which they can help improve the status and outcomes of Black undergraduate men in higher education writ large, including in STEM fields. One highlight of my career is that the U.S. Secretary of Education tweeted about our report, and he deemed our recommendations thoughtful, right? But I want to sort of talk about the problem of this one-sided problem, right? Here's just one data table. I'm not going to bore you to death with tons of data tables. There's like a toddler, an infant rather, in the back of the room. I certainly don't want to bore him with data tables. So I will keep them to a minimum. But here's one from the report, right? In which we talk about racialized sex gaps in U.S. higher education. Now, to be sure, women outnumber men across all racial and ethnic groups in enrollments. For example, there are more white women than white men who enroll in higher education. And so, therefore, it shouldn't surprise us that we also see sex gaps and sex differences in degree attainment. So, you see them here by race, but you will notice that the gaps are most pronounced for black students. They're more pronounced for Latinos and Latinas, right? So usually the question about this is, well, why are there so few young men of color going to college? What's happening? What's wrong with them that, there are women who come from their same homes, their same neighborhoods, their same schooling situations, and so on, who are going to college in higher numbers. So what's up with these brothers? Why are they not going, right? That's usually how the narrative is framed. Now, to be sure, I am going to show here a very quick video clip that sort of really frames and very powerfully illustrates how this gets talked about.
American Morning, the most news in the morning, period. Weekdays 6 Eastern.
Uncovering America, visiting historically black colleges and universities as part of CNN's Black in America series. Those colleges have a distinguished past, but today, while some are thriving, others are struggling with graduation rates at less than 50%. CNN's Chris Lawrence is on the campus of Howard University in Washington, D.C. Hey, Chris, good morning.
Good morning, Alina. Howard University's graduation rate has risen more than 10% over the last 10 years and is now one of the highest of any historically black college. But it's still not where it wants to be, especially when it comes to one part of its student body. It takes 10 seconds on campus to see what's missing. Men. They're outnumbered by women nearly 2 to 1 at Howard University and historically black colleges nationwide. Do you see the gender gap on campus?
I definitely noticed the gap on campus. In all my classes, I have maybe 2 males, if anything.
We gathered some Howard students to talk about the gap.
I'm in School of Communications. Some of those classes, it's maybe me and another guy.
To be fair, white women outnumber white men at schools across the country too. But the gap is wider among black students. Howard recently graduated 863 women and 339 men. What are black women on campus doing that black men aren't?
Oh, I think they're more academically focused.
Dr. Alvin Thornton says black men accepted to Howard have higher SAT scores than the women.
Suggests that once she gets into the educational environment, she studies harder and she works harder.
Overall, out of 100 historically black colleges, only 8 graduate more than half their students.
You'll start out with a class of maybe, randomly 1,000 and end up with 500 because half the people couldn't make it.
By contrast, UCLA graduates 73% of its black students. And at elite schools like Harvard and Yale, black students graduate at nearly the same rate as whites, well above 90%. But those schools have huge endowments that can erase students' financial need. And money matters. 7 out of 10 black students who enrolled but didn't finish college say they dropped out because of high loan debt.
Public séparé.
Experts say the key to keeping more black men in college can be found in the elementary schools they attended.
Let's go back 12 years and see what's the size of his class. Did they have a certified math teacher? How many male teachers were there? What after-school programs did they have?
The graduation rate for black men is improving, just not as much as black women.
I'm focusing on the positive of it. I think it's great that so many women are in college because for so long it was the opposite ways.
And for its part, Howard graduates more black male doctors and lawyers than nearly any school in the country, public, private, white, or black.
Let's stop making it seem like, oh, there are no black males coming to college, because you have 3, 4 black males here, one that's graduating in 2 days, and will be going to law school.
The question is, how many more will join it?
So I want to pick up here where Calvin left us. He left us with a really important statement, right? He said, let's not pretend that there are not black men here who are graduating. You have a few here who are graduating in a few days, right? So let's sort of look at a national graduation statistic. And I want to reframe the way that that particular statistic gets talked about. So what you see here is a visual representation of, let's say, a cohort of black undergraduate men in U.S. higher education, right? So just imagine that there are 10 of them, right? Unfortunately, and these are at public universities, by the way, unfortunately, by the junior year, exactly 2/3 of them who started haven't finished, right? So there's this nasty statistic that a third of black undergraduate men at public colleges and universities earn bachelor's degrees within 6 years, which is lowest among both sexes in all racial groups. Huge problem, for sure. We ought to be alarmed. We ought to be outraged, right? So, but usually our emphasis is on the 7 guys who left. We're running ourselves in circles trying to figure out what happened institutionally, individually, financially, and otherwise that compelled those 7 guys to drop out or transfer, right? Not finish in the places where they started, switch their major from physics to sociology, right? Those are the kinds of things that we almost unanimously concern ourselves with. Well, what about these 3 guys? What was it that kept these guys enrolled in college, enabled them to succeed and to persist through degree attainment? Let's even imagine for a moment that all 3 of these brothers are in engineering. Well, how did that happen, given the narrative that we continually hear about students of color in engineering? Doesn't it seem only logical that if we are interested in increasing student of color success in engineering and other STEM fields, that we probably ought to study and talk with and learn from students of color who've actually been successful in STEM fields to figure out what it was that enabled them to do that? So that's what my work is about. So I'm going to talk with you about a study that the center released 3 weeks ago today in New York City. It's a report that captures the best of what we learned in the New York City Black and Latino Male High School Achievement Study. I'll tell you more about the study in a second. What I think is important to show, though, is my favorite page from the report. So you will see that this page, and you may not be able to read the headline so well. The headline says, "Meeting Ourselves, 13 Black and Latino male researchers from the University of Pennsylvania Graduate School of Education were afforded incredibly powerful opportunities to meet ourselves," right? So it's me, the postdoc in my center, and 11 graduate students, all Black and Latino men, who traveled to New York City over a 4-month period weekly for 2 days to find Black and Latino males who were succeeding in high school, who were college bound and college ready. We were convinced that they existed, right? Despite the narrative that we continually hear about young men of color, particularly in urban environments like Indianapolis, like New York City, like Philadelphia, where I live, we somehow knew that there were young men of color in public high schools in New York City who were succeeding. We had a scary suspicion that that was true because it very much represented us, right? These are 13 Ivy Leaguers who came from, almost all of us came from very poor homes, right, in financial situations. All of us attended public schools. But yet we were convinced that there were some guys who were like us in these schools and that they were worthy of being sought out and learned from. So I'll tell you a bit more about the study. We did this research in 40 public high schools across New York City. I absolutely guarantee you that these were not high-performing high schools. In fact, they were definitely high-minority high schools. High minoritized students, blacks and Latinos more specifically. On average, they were about 94% black and Latino. About 67% of them were free lunch eligible, which is a proxy for socioeconomic status, right? Almost all of the others were eligible for reduced lunch. So these were not schools where there were students who come from generations of families where people, their parents and others, had earned degrees in STEM fields. I can assure you of that, right? I think it's also important to note that none of these were charter schools. This is not a slam or a diss on charter schools. But I think that there is a narrative that's even been created about sort of where educational possibility resides. Is either, people erroneously presume, in very elite, very expensive private independent schools, or in these novel charter schools, right? No, these were traditional public schools. We did 325 individual interviews, one-on-one interviews with Black and Latino male high school juniors and seniors who had B averages and above. They were engaged in multiple school clubs and activities. Each planned to enroll in college after high school. An important footnote here is that we did this research this past spring. Every single senior whom we interviewed had applied to and was accepted to college. All of them are now in college. The juniors whom we interviewed last spring are now seniors, and they're currently applying to college. Lastly, the last criterion here is that each of these 325 young men had taken a sequence of courses thus far that would qualify them for admission to a 4-year post-secondary institution. The way we found these guys is that we contacted principals, assistant principals, and guidance counselors at each of the 40 schools and said, could you find for us Black and Latino male juniors and seniors who fit this profile? No one contacted us back and said, there are no men here in our school who fit this profile, right? We found 325 of them. I have long argued in my work that the access agenda on its own is incomplete. Certainly getting more students to college is a very important goal. Getting more students into STEM fields is a really important goal, but ensuring that they're successful once they get there is also another important part of the agenda. So given that, we also had this subset of students, 90 college students from 44 different colleges and universities. What these students have in common is that they all were Black and Latino males, but they also graduated from the same 40 high schools in which we had done the work, right? So we wanted to see how prepared were these students actually when they got to college. I'm going to say a bit more about that much later in the speech here. I do want to acknowledge that the work that we did in New York City built on prior work that I've done. My National Black Male College Achievement Study was funded by a combination of 7 grants. But in 2012, I got a grant from Lumina Foundation, not in 2012, but prior to that. But part of the grant was to produce a report that captured the best of what I learned about Black male success in higher education. So this particular report was funded by Lumina and has led to some subsequent work. This particular study took me to 42 colleges and universities in 20 different states across the country. You see them listed here. I was not as wise then as I am now. I didn't have a team of 13 researchers to travel with me. I very foolishly went to all these places and interviewed all these students myself. But you will see that there are 6 different institution types represented in the National Black Male College Achievement Study. I thought it was important to understand how Black undergraduate men succeed in college broadly, but also to understand specifically in specific institutional contexts what it takes to thrive and survive. For example, my youngest brother went to Morehouse College. What it takes to be successful at Morehouse is very different from what it takes to be a successful student in a STEM field at University of Pennsylvania where I teach, given sort of the racial differences and the composition and ethos of the campus and so on. So it was important to understand achievement and context. I will tell you a bit more, just a bit more about the national study. I did 2 to 3 hour individual one-on-one interviews with 219 Black undergraduate men who had earned GPAs above 3.0, who had established lengthy records of leadership and active engagement on their campuses and multiple student organizations. They had been elected by their peers to 2 or more student organizations. They had also cultivated meaningful, substantive relationships with faculty and administrators on their campuses. In fact, that's how I found them. I contacted presidents, provosts, deans of academic schools, directors of minority student support services and cultural centers and so on, and said, I bet you have black men on your campus who fit this profile. And at each of the 42 campuses, they all came back and said, well, as a matter of fact, we do. And they found these students for me who fit this profile. These were guys who also participated, and I think this will really resonate with this audience. These were guys who participated in what the architects of the National Survey of Student Engagement call enriching educational experiences. Like they did collaborative research with the faculty member. They did an internship in their field away from their campus. They studied abroad, right? And these kinds of things that we know to add serious value to students' learning and career readiness and educational trajectories and so on. And lastly, these were guys who earned numerous awards, scholarships, and honors for their college achievements. Given the narrative that's been created about students of color generally, and black men specifically in American higher education, I think at this point I've convinced you. In fact, I told you that I found the guys. But you may think, oh, well, these guys must have been in fields other than the ones that we're here to talk about at this conference. As it turns out, yeah, just about a fourth of them were STEM majors. Right? So there's this like impossible narrative that's been created about students of color in STEM that if they're doing all of that, they can't be good in their science classes. Or they're doing so poorly in their engineering classes because they're like engaged in all these things outside of engineering. No, actually, yeah, about a fourth of this sample were guys who were extraordinarily engaged on their campuses. They were earning good grades, and they were in STEM fields. I would like to, in the interest of time, introduce you to one. His name is Cullen Buie. Cullen, at the time that I interviewed him, was a senior at The Ohio State University. His major was mechanical engineering. He had a 3.79 GPA. You will see here that Cullen held lots of leadership positions. He was president of NASB, for example. So he had leadership positions, and he was engaged in things both within STEM that were STEM related and in the broader campus context. He did pretty good for himself with summer internships. He got away from Columbus to do some great internships at Polaroid, Procter & Gamble, and Dow Chemicals. The guy won a handful of really impressive scholarships and awards and things for his college achievements. In fact, this number that you see under his GPA, it's the amount of merit-based scholarships that Cullen garnered for himself at Ohio State. What I think is also noteworthy is that he got involved in undergraduate research really early, second semester of his freshman year, to be exact. So this guy had 3.5 years of serious research experience with Professor Greg Washington, a black male professor in engineering at the time at Ohio State. He's now dean of engineering at UC Irvine. Cullen was his student. Now, I want to just say just a thing more about Cullen. Let's see how this plays out.
There's a researcher at Ohio State named Cullen Buie who's developed a microcontroller that will someday power robots that will clean toxic waste. Businesses are eager to bring Cullen's discoveries to market, but they'll have to wait. Because he's got a final Monday morning. Cullen's only a junior at Ohio State. He's one of many Ohio State undergraduates involved in hands-on research that will impact the way we live.
So this particular thing that you just saw was on the Ohio State website. It was on the engineering website. It was on the sort of the main university website, and then engineering picked it up and put it on their specific website. It was also broadcast on the Jumbotron at Ohio State football games. Imagine what this must have done for Cullen's confidence, right? It started out by talking about a researcher at Ohio State University. Imagine what it must have done for his identity as a scientist to be referred to first as a researcher, right? In case you're wondering what happened to this guy, no, he didn't drop out of engineering at the last minute. In fact, he continued on and got a master's and a PhD in mechanical engineering at Stanford. He got a postdoc that was funded by NIH at UC Berkeley. And he's now a tenure-track faculty member and an endowed chair. I'm not an endowed chair. At MIT, this guy, right? Now, I don't view Cullen as exceptional. I think he's great. I love him. Like his story has done wonders for my career and things. Like, it's great. But I am convinced that there are several other Cullens out there whom she has one, right? We all have them. But yet people very rarely take the time to talk with them, to understand the undercurrents and enablers of their success. It was one of those things that on our research team that we talked about before entering the New York City schools. Here are these 13 Ivy Leaguers. Yeah, no one had ever sat us down to ask us, well, how did you manage to get to where you are? How did you manage to succeed? Let me take some notes to figure out, what kinds of policies and practices are common in your 13 trajectories that are worthy of replication, right? I just think it's a seriously half-baked strategy to broaden participation of blacks and Latinos in STEM fields if we don't talk to blacks and Latinos who've been successful to understand the enablers of their success. So that's at the heart of this anti-deficit achievement framework for the study of minoritized students in STEM fields that I have developed. That particular anti-deficit achievement framework is published as a chapter in the volume that Dr. Newman and I co-edited, the Students of Color in STEM volume. Before I show you the framework and sort of talk with you about how it works, I just want to sort of maybe lay out for all of us sort of an understanding of what I mean by anti-deficit. So I took these commonly asked questions about students of color in STEM. Now, this isn't just black men, right? This is black women, Latinas, Latino males, and Native Americans, right? So there are these questions about these students of color in STEM fields that I took and I flipped them inside out. I looked at the upside of achievement, right? So I'll give you some examples. And these examples, by the way, are in the chapter. I have it available in PDF. I'll pass that on to Kim and her team to share with the conference attendees. But one such question is, why do so few minoritized students pursue STEM majors? Well, anti-deficit reframing would be what stimulates and sustains students' interest in attaining STEM degrees, right? Sounds like much could be learned from that. That is instructive and useful. Another is, why are they so underprepared for college-level math and science courses? The anti-deficit reframing is, how do STEM achievers from low-resource high schools, like the ones that we did our study in New York, transcend academic underpreparedness and previous educational disadvantage? How do they do that? I have an actual story of a kid for whom this is true. Unfortunately, he wasn't in STEM, but this guy grew up on the south side of Chicago and attended a very, very low-resource public high school in Chicago, south side, right? But we got him admitted to the University of Pennsylvania, to the Wharton School. Yeah, so he graduated last spring with a 3.5 GPA from the Wharton School, and he now works for Morgan Stanley on Wall Street in New York City, right? Well, how did he do that? Coming from a high school that's not like the private elite preparatory high schools that many Penn students come from who get into Wharton. Well, how did this kid from this public school in Chicago do that? It just seems to make sense to me that we ought to reframe our questions in this way. Another is, why are their grades and other indicators of academic achievement disproportionately lower than their white and Asian American counterparts? Important question, but I also would argue that much could be learned from a question like, well, what enables students of color in STEM to make the dean's list? You know, some of them do make the dean's list, right? To compete successfully for prestigious fellowships and research opportunities and earn high GPAs. Why do so many of them change their majors to non-STEM fields? Well, what compels students of color in STEM fields, despite the academic challenge and the underrepresentation of same race peers and faculty, to persist in the majors? Last one here, because this could go on and on and on. Why do so few continue on to graduate degree programs in STEM, right? Well, what are some common aspects of students' pathways from high school completion through doctoral degree attainment in STEM fields from which we can learn? So in the volume, in my chapter, there's this framework that inverts these commonly asked questions about students of color in STEM, and is situated in 3 domains: their pre-college socialization and readiness for higher education and preparedness for STEM, their academic achievement in college, as well as their post-college persistence in STEM fields. Again, I would argue that reframing these questions in this way, using this framework, not just in research, by the way, but also in the way that we approach practice, could be really instructive. Just imagine for a moment, right? Wouldn't it be awesome if there were a study situated in the framework that I just laid out that takes these commonly asked questions, flips them inside out, looks for the enablers of achievement and so on, at 25 major research universities with highly ranked engineering and science programs, right? You know, just imagine if we did what I did in the National Black Male College Achievement Study and what my team did in the New York City Black and Latino Male High School Achievement Study, if we did that at these 25 places that are thought to be rigorous, right, and thought to be like among like the best, most challenging, most prestigious places in science and technology and mathematics fields, and found 250 Black and Latino undergraduate persisters, meaning juniors and seniors, women and men, Latinos, Latinas, Black men, Black women, who hadn't changed their majors to something else, but very much were committed to earning their bachelor's degrees in STEM fields. And then also alumni, right? So that's another missed opportunity for learning. Yeah, there are people who graduate from these programs that we have been talking about all day long, but rarely do we bring them together to learn from them. Well, what enabled you to persist and sort of transcend what we know might be some obstacles and environmental toxins and so on here? Wouldn't it be fabulous? Couldn't much be learned from a study like this? I see at least one affirmative head nod. Yeah, I see a couple, right? Yeah, I just wish that I could convince the National Science Foundation to fund this study. I've proposed it twice now. So maybe if somebody else has some other suggestions for places that I might go to for funding to get somebody to do this, I think that would be a real serious contribution that would in fact help broaden participation in STEM fields. Yeah, I want to come back. I think this is an important statement that was just made. I want to come back to this in just a moment during the Q&A. I'm going to skip. You will remember the definition that I operationalized for minoritized. What I want to say, though, the reason I brought it back around is that I do think that it's important, this last part about the context that render people minorities, right? The practices and the environmental kinds of things. So there is this book that is among the most widely read and cited in my field. It's called How College Affects Students. It's like a Bible. It's huge. It's like this compendium of student outcomes research concerning undergraduates. In the book, the authors, for whom I have enormous respect, make a statement with which I find disagreeable, right? they argue that the impact of college is largely determined by individual effort and involvement in the academic, interpersonal, and extracurricular offerings on a campus. All right, so maybe I don't disagree with the statement, but I do disagree that this ought not be the case, right? It shouldn't be individual effort that is the largest determinant, right? There has to be some institutional responsibility for ensuring that students are successful, for ensuring that STEM professors are teaching in ways that are culturally inclusive and engaging and not boring to death, right? So those are the kinds of arguments that are made in the first edition of mine and Stephen Quay's book, Student Engagement in Higher Education. We argue that institutions, including their faculties and administrators who work on those campuses, ought to assume some responsibility for engaging students. In fact, conceptually, we're arguing in the book, and I've argued elsewhere in my work, that we ought to shift the onus for engagement, right? So many times in spaces like this, conversations are being had about, well, why aren't students of color taking more ownership of their learning and taking more responsibility for reaching out to a faculty member to get involved in his research or to be on a project team of her faculty member and so on, right? Well, geez, I happen to believe that, if I were the only black dude in a physics course and none of the faculty in my program are faculty of color, yeah, I might not have the confidence to go up to this physics professor and say, yeah, how could I get involved in your research? Especially if I get a sense that that physics professor is oozing low expectations, right? When he's surprised that I have something smart to say, or if he questions, whether or not I got help with the assignment because it just seems way too good to have been done by a little colored boy. Those kinds of experiences that racial microaggressions and stereotype threat and those kinds of things. So, there has to be some institutional responsibility for ensuring the success of students of color in STEM. Now, I happen to believe that there are some examples of institutional excellence, places that do a good job of engaging, retaining, graduating students of color in STEM fields, sending them on to graduate school in the way that Cullen was sent to Stanford and now he's at MIT, right? There are examples of that. We just have to choose to look for them, right? I will close with a statement that I wrote in the afterword for this book on fostering the success of racial and ethnic minoritized students in STEM fields. Now, this particular book is specific to minority-serving institutions, HBCUs, HSIs, tribal colleges, and so on. In the book, the editors and the authors of the respective chapters make the case that much can be learned from minority-serving institutions. I don't think that that's an argument that's hard to sell to this group, right? Like, we've been hearing for years that there is something environmentally, culturally, and so on that happens at HBCUs, for example, that helps explain their extraordinary production of people who go on to earn PhDs in STEM fields. As a footnote, I think I mentioned earlier that I'm the first and only faculty person of color to have been hired in my department at Penn. Across the entire Graduate School of Education, there are only 4 black faculty members. 3 of us have bachelor's degrees from historically black colleges and universities. So the editors and authors here make the case that this is an example of how we can look for success and learn from success in places like Spelman, Morehouse, Albany State, where I went, Fisk, and so on. But in the afterword, in this particular book, I argued that if faculty in economics departments were to employ many of the philosophies and practices highlighted in this book, if researchers were to concentrate on better understanding the barriers to student persistence in economics from freshman year through doctoral degree attainment, and if foundations and other funding agencies were to invest in expanding the pipeline of economists of color in the ways that the NSF and the NIH have invested in STEM, I comfortably predict that we would see an uptick in the number of PhD recipients of color in economics. In many ways, this book and ongoing conversations concerning diversifying the STEM professions could serve as a national model for diversifying other fields. This very much fits within the genre of my talk with you this afternoon. When we get together to talk about broadening participation and increasing access and equity for students of color in STEM fields, even at conferences like this, right? Like, very rarely do we acknowledge the success that venues like this produce, right? I can assure you, Dr. Nguyen, that there is not a conference of economists this size anywhere in the country right now where folks are rolling up their sleeves in the way that you all have masterfully done here to figure out how do we get more economists of color. That's definitely not happening in education, my field. It's probably not happening in political science. So I think you get the point here, right? That there is success, but we just have to be deliberate about seeking it, learning from it, replicating it. So that was my way of congratulating you and tipping my hat to you for bringing together a group of very committed, well-intentioned educators and practitioners who care so deeply about broadening participation for students of color in STEM. Thank you. So how much time do we have for questions and reactions and critiques? I welcome critiques too.
Enjoyed your talk, and it was very
Thank you.
interesting. You took issue with the one question or the one statement about what impacts student success. This statement, and in my opinion, you might have even taken it a lot further than it had been intentioned. But the question I have for you, because I really believe, and I'm talking about for me personally and looking at my own success, I really believe that some of the elements that a person has inside of them contributes immensely to their success. And you really didn't hit on that. You kind of took it from the other place to the other place. So I want you, if you could tell me or share with us, it could be from some of your research, but what elements inside that person contributes to their success in STEM?
Sure. Great question, and sort of soft pushback. I appreciate that. I guess my response to it, and this is not a dismissive response. It's just a public admission. So I'm not a cognitive psychologist, or a behavioral psychologist, so I don't really study, motivation and sort of people's sort of internal characteristics. In fact, there are times when I disagree with folks who go too far in that direction, because I have seen students who have been thought of previously as not being turned on, not being motivated, not being invested in their own success, but something happens that turns them on in a way that was once thought impossible. A very real example, when I was a doctoral student at Indiana, I taught an undergraduate course. There was this student, Corey Buckner is his name. Corey, at the time that he enrolled in my course, had a 2.2 undergraduate GPA at IU. He was on academic probation, as a matter of fact, right? But taking my course, and this is not ego stroking or patting myself on the back, it's just the best example that I have. Folks would have thought that, well, Corey just doesn't have the drive that Christopher has or that Shaun has. He just doesn't have it. There's something about Christopher and Shaun that that Corey doesn't have. 2.2, academic probation. Took that course, got immediately turned on. Immediately turned, I was the first black professor that he had, and I was a doctoral student at the time, right? The first black professor he had at IU. You know, this guy didn't quite make 3.0. 2.97 is what he graduated with. Then he was so inspired by this whole process of student development, from his own trajectory, from his own narrative, his own encounter, that he decided to pursue a master's degree in higher education and student affairs immediately after completing his bachelor's degree. No one would have predicted 18, 20 months prior that Corey would have been in somebody's graduate program, being that he was on probation with a 2.2. So, you know, he enrolled in that program. My friend, Dr. Lori Patton Davis was his professor. Corey did very well. He graduated from that program, no problem. His grades were amazing. Went on to work in higher education. He now works at the University of Southern California. Yet Corey contacted me last week about writing a letter of recommendation for his admission to a doctoral program in higher education, right? I absolutely refuse to accept that, well, there are students who come and they're just not motivated. Well, it could be that they're bored. Or it could be that, you know, the faculty member isn't doing anything to engage that student, right? That's just the best answer I have.
You know, I have a question that follows exactly what you hit on, which is the opposite of the previous question, because there is a psychologist by the name of Dr. Robert Brooks, and he talks about a charismatic adult. And that is what you just described. So your scenario in terms of turning someone on. So I wanted to know if you incorporated that aspect of people's background, if they had been inspired by that charismatic adult, such as you seem to have been for Corey in the example that you mentioned. Have you used that as a part of your study?
Sure. So I didn't want this to become like terribly researchy. But these studies, the two multi-institutional studies that I talked about, the National Black Male College Achievement Study and the one in New York, they were trajectory analyses. So we had people walk us back to their childhoods and walk us through sort of pivotal moments, important, influential persons that they met who turned them on in a way or made a difference, right? Or a course that they took that, you know, that really helped to solidify their science identities, as an example, right? So yes, like in many instances, people would talk about, yeah, it was when I had my first black male teacher. I'm not saying that's the only solution here, but you know, people would say, he saw something in me that no one previously had seen in me. I guess it doesn't surprise me, given the one case example that I brought here for you of Cullen Buie, it doesn't surprise me that his professor was a black male professor in engineering at Ohio State who made this man who is now an endowed chair at MIT. Like, that doesn't surprise me, given the kinds of moments and important persons who've been named along these trajectories. We met last night.
Yeah, you got the whiny question from the deep south here.
Yes, okay.
So, seeing that list of institutions that you
I know
put up
LSU
there,
was not on it. I'm sorry.
No, I'm it reminded me of a meeting a couple years ago. It was a meeting at the Howard Hughes Medical Institute. And Tom Check, Nobel laureate, was and president of HHMI at the time, was managing the meeting, and a member of the National Academy raised his hand, and he was from Stanford University, and started to say about all the things that Stanford University was doing for its minorities.
Minoritized students.
And
can you say that?
Minoritized students. Thank you. Duly noted. So in the audience, Freeman Hrabowski raised his hand and he said, "Dear sir, how many minoritized students have you had in your biology program in the last 10 years?"
Sure.
And boy, that shut him up real quick. So when I saw that list, I wondered whether a better framing for that particular proposal done twice might be to add UMBC and maybe a couple other places, maybe one in the Deep South, that has graduated more PhDs of color than a number of those places put together. Maybe you could just have Isaiah Warner, who's like a rock star and the equivalent of Bob Grubbs for white guys, and just compare what's successful among those, and then take a certain number of those and contrast the two. That's my whiny question from Deep South.
So I think your question also had embedded in it some advice, right? That I will take seriously. I mean, I really, really would like to get this study funded. So maybe what you're saying is the thing that's gonna do that, maybe. But okay, so here's the thing. I have the absolute utmost respect for Freeman Hrabowski. I think that what UMBC has done is important. I respect it. I think it's really instructive. But I am afraid that it helps feed into a narrative that, well, yeah, that's happening at UMBC, but none of it is happening at Cornell. And I know that your example was that when the person was talking about Stanford, rah-rah Stanford, and the question was, well, how many persons of color have you graduated in biology from Stanford, and the person didn't have the answer. I'm pretty sure that, yeah, there have been some persons of color from Stanford who have graduated in biology. It just worries me sometimes, right, when we get like 2-1 note, that, well, we should be more like the HBCUs and learn from them and what they have done culturally. I am a proud graduate and proponent of an HBCU.
Me too.
My partner is, my brother is, you know, it's great. I love HBCUs. But yeah, I'm pretty sure that, you know, over at Purdue, that's also happening in ways that we just choose not to look for, in ways that could be instructive for Purdue. Right? Purdue is not Howard.
Right.
Purdue is Purdue. Right? So I guess that's my rationale here for this list. These are places that are highly ranked in engineering and other science fields. I know for sure, they may not be among the top 50 producers of people of color who go on to become scientists or who go on to graduate programs or whatever, but I'm pretty sure that Princeton graduated a black male in engineering last year, and I would just love to know, well, how did that happen?
Right.
I would love to prove that empirically. If I could just get, you know, that money to do this, that would be great.
I enjoyed your talk.
Thank you.
And I just wanted to add that institutions are doing some of what you're suggesting. I'm a graduate of Georgia Tech, and every year Georgia Tech invites students that they want to come to their graduate school. That's why they have all the high rankings of PhDs in engineering and all of that. But they also call on us, the alums, who've gotten PhDs from Georgia Tech, and they always invite us to come and talk to these students that they're trying to recruit. So a lot of that is going on so that they can share with the students, you know, without barriers, and tell them the truth about how they're going to be beat up and all that stuff, but yet you continue to persist. So some of that is going on.
I love that you raised that example, right? I think it's instructive. Like, we need to hear more about, like, people need to be asking you questions, right? About the details and the mechanics of what that thing is that Georgia Tech does, because it sounds like it works, right? It sounds like it's replicable in other places. In the New York high school study, we found these amazing guidance counseling practices, like things that people were doing that didn't cost a dime. I think I might have time for just a quick example, right? I mentioned to you that these were largely low resource high schools. So many of them had just a single guidance counselor for the entire high school. But in the report from the study, we write about how college-going cultures were created in these high schools. At one school, I interviewed a senior who talked about the impact of the intercom announcements on his college-going aspirations. Every day when the principal made the announcements on the intercom, it ended with announcements about who had been admitted to what colleges and universities. So if a person got an acceptance letter, say from University of Pennsylvania, it would be read on the announcements, Shaun Harper has been offered admission to University of Pennsylvania, for example, right? That didn't cost a dime to do that. But this senior talked about when he was a freshman, that for him, it made college going normal. It made it sound like, well, that's what people do here. Every day I'm hearing on the announcement, such and such has gotten into here and there, and so on. Now, this guy applied to Duke. So, we had them fill out a profile form in advance of the interview. So I asked him, I was like, so I see that you've applied to Duke. What made you interested in Duke? He harkened back to the announcements that had been made on the intercom, and he said, last year there was this dude who lives in my apartment building who goes to this school. He was a senior last year, and he got accepted to Duke. He said, I would not have thought that Duke was possible for me until I heard his name read on the announcements that he had gotten admitted to Duke. So it compelled me to apply to Duke. It's those kinds of things that, again, are amazing practices that cost no money but don't get shared, right? Like, I happen to believe that should be happening now in every public high school in the country, right? But people wouldn't even know that was being done in this one random school in the Bronx had we not gone looking for success and enablers of success and practices that lead to success. So, yes, thank you.
As a mechanical engineering graduate of Purdue University,
I told you.
Hey. I'm still standing. I'm still strong. I'm glad that you're looking at the 33 and the third. I'm interested, though, in what influence, if you've seen any, that those 33 have had on the other 67. Because sometimes it's through our peers that we get that motivation and that grit, as Dr. Strayhorn at Iowa State kind of talks about, too.
Sure. So, great question. One of the things that I will say, again, without becoming too researchy, your question reminds me of my most recent peer-reviewed article. It's in the Review of Research and Education. In that particular article, I talk about and introduce this whole notion of what I call peer pedagogies. And basically, it's students teaching other students what it takes to thrive and succeed in predominantly white contexts, and in places that might be racially toxic and so on. I give an actual example that is STEM related in that piece, where this one student in my study, in the National Black Male College Achievement Study, talked about when he was a freshman, there was this student organization fair, where the students have the tables with literature and they're getting people to join and so on. There was this black woman who was a junior who stopped him and said, oh, hey, you're in engineering. I am an officer in NASB. She said to him, you should join NASB. And the guy was sort of like, okay, but, a bit ambivalent about sort of like what NASB was and why it was important. So she went on to sort of help him to understand that you are going to be the only black student in your engineering classes. Therefore, you're going to need NASB as a place for affirmation, for validation, for community, for support, for networking, and so on. I cannot tell you how many times I heard the students in the national study talk about those kinds of moments and how those moments then in turn shaped their inclination to give back and pay it forward in particular ways, to replicate those same practices to help advance the community and to help teach the community about what it takes to succeed and so on. So a lot of that was happening. On the predominantly white campuses, almost always these students were involved in a mixture of ethnic student organizations and sort of larger, more mainstream organizations. And it was through the ethnic student organizations that they were able to sort of help school the new generation of people who were coming to the institutions.
Hello. Thank
Hello.
you so much. I really appreciate your studies and what
Thank you.
have done and what you found. And you certainly touched a very deep-seated concern that I have had for over 40 years in teaching mathematics. And I was wondering, what have you decided on your next research effort that you are going to embark upon? I was wondering about that.
There is a saying that third time is the charm. Yeah, I would love to do this if I could get someone to fund it. I just think it's important, and I think it's instructive, and it aggravates me that we keep getting talked about in the same way, the same sort of deficit, doom and gloom way, when there are people among us who are succeeding and much could be learned from us. So the answer to the question,
Okay.
what would be this?
And I'd just like to thank you. I know you're thinking about it, but I'd just like to say that I have been teaching math for over 40 years in many different settings and working on that same question, what stimulates a student? And I've been asked the question many times also. What has stimulated me at the University of Maryland? I got my doctorate from there, math education, and I was questioned all the time, what stimulated me to continue to pursue my studies? And I have continued to pursue the question, what turns students from failing? Because I meet so many students who come to me. I have a math center, and I teach adjunct professor at the University of District of Columbia. But what is the underlying factor that stimulates students who are failing in everything possibly to turn from failing in all subjects, especially math, and once they get the math going, understanding that, turn the corner and just excel. And that's something that I'm really interested in continuing to pursue, and I'd like to talk to you about some of the things I have done to turn students' lives around in math, which thousands of students, which in turn has enabled them, empowered them to move forward to remarkable accomplishments.
I would love and very much appreciate the opportunity to sit at your feet and learn from you what has enabled you to do this for the 40 years over 40 years that you've
Over
done
40,
it.
yes.
So I appreciate that invitation.
And what I'm doing now is just trying to isolate certain things that I do with students. How do I get them motivated? People ask me these questions. How do you motivate the student? And I'm examining it myself. How do you motivate even very young? I really teach K through graduate school in the Math Center and in some of the programs that I work with. But I'm
Thank
searching for that answer, and I was wondering if what you do next in your research, you might be interested.
I hope
and
so.
somebody who's interested in the similar kind of thing with mathematics.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
There was something that you said that I think is also noteworthy here that I didn't acknowledge earlier about who these students are in the samples for these studies. I love that you talked about helping turn around. You use turnaround language. I have a thing for turnaround narratives and hard turns in people's trajectories that really help to reshape their outcomes. These studies are not of people who've always been extraordinarily gifted, or they actually probably were, but their giftedness wasn't awakened. But these are not people who were always like the highest performing students. for many of them, there were hard turns in their trajectories when they met someone who could teach them how to do math in a way that no one else had previously been successful in teaching them, right? And they were able to fly from there. So, so thank you for the opportunity to acknowledge even that, you know, these are not people who were geeks always, right? Like their inner geekdom was awakened oftentimes. All right, I think we have two last questions here.
My name is Emmanuel Sims. I'm from HBCU at Southern University at Shreveport, and I got a 2-point kind of question and a comment as well. Being that I was a student, part of my testimony was that I didn't make good. I was a straight A student, but I couldn't get the ACT score to the way I wanted. I'm not ashamed to say I only made a 19 on my ACT score, but in spite of that, I went to Southern University at Shreveport where they cultured you and helped you, and I got in my STEM program. And as a freshman, I was the freshman class president, and I was the NSB chapter president at my school. And as a sophomore, and I'm currently a sophomore now, I'm the SGA president of the school and the student government president of the state of Louisiana. And I'm not saying that to brag on it, but my question to you is, how can I, as a student leader, work with administration at my school so I can help more students have testimonies instead of failure stories? Because a lot of students, they end up leaving our institution saying, oh, well, I couldn't pass this class, or I couldn't do this, or the school didn't recognize me for my high achievements, and I go to another school and they say, oh, you're such a wonderful student. So how, as a student leader, can I work with the faculty and administration to better keep our students and help the students that are there?
Fantastic question. Just so you know, you scored 1 point higher than me on the ACT. I think it's impressive that as a sophomore, you're president of the student government. I once was the president of the student government at Albany State. As a senior, though, not as a sophomore. I fondly reflect on that experience and the opportunity to have access to the president of my university and to sort of help keep at the forefront of her consciousness pressing student issues. So you have a very rare opportunity in that if your student government works the way that it works on many other campuses, you have access to some really influential people on your campus. I think that engaging them in a conversation about trends that can, in fact, be substantiated with data would be helpful, but encouraging them to not pursue those trends in the ways that, in the deficit-oriented ways that we typically pursue them. Let me put this differently. So let's say, just for ease of example, that you have the black male attrition problem, you know, the low graduation rates on your campus. Helping your president and other administrators there understand that, you know, we probably should work on a project that not only celebrates black male student success, but also in a very strategic and intentional way brings together black men like yourself on the campus to be learned from, to bring back black male alumni from the institution who could be learned from, who could mentor, who could provide insights into what it takes to successfully navigate the place, both to current students, but also to the administration of the campus and the faculty of the campus, right? I've been a faculty member for a decade now, and I must say that I'm not sure that my faculty colleagues are always conscious of the things that they do to undermine student success or perhaps even enable it, right? So having an opportunity for, and a platform for people students, alumni, and so on your campus, I think could be an extraordinary effort. It's one that I don't see often. Last question here.
How you doing? My name is Simeon Wilson. I'm from Dillard University, and mine is more of a statement. For me, when I was younger, I got the ability to go to a summer camp at the college that I'm actually currently attending. And what they did for us, they brought us in and they treated us as we were students. And for us being young growing up in New Orleans, you know, it's not the place where most people are focused on education, and most lifestyles don't go that way. But for us, going to the summer camp and getting that early experience as a child, it gave us the ability to look forward to going to college. And getting there and having like professors that were able to, you know, guide you and work with you because they understood your situation that you were coming from, that made a big difference. And I don't see it enough at different universities like, I guess, like colleges working with elementary schools. They always say high schools, they always say middle schools, but they don't ever say elementary. And getting them in the early stages of development is really important because for me, the moment I went to that summer camp, I was like, I'm going to college, I'm going to finish. That was the motivation for me to do so.
I very much appreciate you sharing that narrative and, you know, letting us into your trajectory to help understand, right? Like a pivotal moment for you is what you just described is one of the things that I most appreciate about Chris Newman's work. He has done work with Sylvia Hurtado out at UCLA and others around the development of student science identities and the kinds of experiences that not only help develop, but also to help nurture and sustain student science identities. And it very much sounds like this summer experience for you was a thing that, you know, really sort of awakened and sustained your science identity. So this is just one example of, again, the kind of powerful learning that that is available to us about student success if we just seek out students who've succeeded to figure out how they succeeded and to understand what it was about that summer program. What were its features that are replicable?
Well, I know for the most part, it was the fact that you actually felt like you were in college. And for you being in elementary school, to be on that level and to see like older guys and older females going to school, getting their education, and also working with you. You might have been doing like simple things like simple arithmetic, but you felt like you were a part of it, and it became a part of you in turn.
Yeah, maybe I'm simple here. Maybe I'm just like, maybe I just don't know, right? Or I'm just like too, I don't know what it is. But, you know, what you just described to me seems really important because these programs are a dime a dozen, right? Like there are a lot of pre-college kinds of programs to get students interested in higher education generally and STEM specifically. But, you know, I don't mean to offend anyone here, so present company excluded. But many of those things are lousy. Like they don't do what they set out to do. Could it be that they're treating middle schoolers like middle schoolers instead of treating them like college students, right? It just seems to me, and I'm not being gratuitous, it just seems to me that what you just described sounds really important, right? So, yeah, thank you.
And again, thank you for the question, or thank you for sharing that note. It's not what we do, but how we do it. That's what the LSM program is about. Would you please share with me? Thank you, Shaun, for his provoking talk.